Could you explain your role in the Kansas City, Missouri School District during the years between 1971 and 1997?
Well, yes, I had multiple roles during that period of time. I was a substitute teacher, I was a parent, I was a community activist, and also during that period I was a district employee. So worked with it from a lot of different perspectives, and also during that period of time I lived for a while in one of the surrounding school districts at the time when Kansas City was wanting to include suburban districts into the whole desegregation lawsuit. Early on in 1971, prior to 6C, one of the first things I remember was one of the first schools that they, quote, desegregated. And it was Humboldt School, which was located, I believe, at 11th, and I think that street is Holmes. It's no longer there now, but the way they integrated that school, they put all the white children on the lower floor. They put all the children of color that were mostly black on the second floor. They bussed in black teachers for the black kids. They had white teachers for the white kids, and the children never, ever mixed or mingled at all. They didn't have recess together. They didn't have lunch together or anything. And I remember it quite distinctly because I refused to sub there. I would not sub there. And my own child was an infant. She was born in 1972, but my sisters, nieces and nephews, they all went to Kansas City, Missouri schools. And it was a subject that we talked about in our family every single day. It was a huge discussion around it. When my daughter actually started school, we'd moved away for a while, but we'd moved back to the area, but we moved to Liberty, Missouri. And around 1975, 76, before the desegregation lawsuit was finalized, Liberty was one of the districts that they wanted to desegregate. They wanted to bring children in, and it was actually kind of frightening because they had community meetings in Liberty about their children coming to Kansas City, and people came armed to the meeting to discuss it. They had shotguns and things in the back of their pickups. I'd never seen anything like that in my life. And to be perfectly frank, she was already going to school in a white school district, and I wasn't really that interested in having my kindergarten student bused anywhere, not even there, but it was kind of interesting. We eventually moved back into Kansas City because I didn't like some of the things we experienced in that district as the whole process was going on. Kindergarten teacher, I don't know if I can say these things, but the kindergarten teacher actually called her a nigger. And I knew I would have to make a move. So that is back when we moved then back into Kansas City for her to go to school here. And that would have been late 70s, I don't know, maybe around 1980. But my sister actually went to all her education here. She never went to an integrated school here in Kansas City. At the time she was in school, they had what they call 6C. That was what the desegregation perspectives was then called. And the area that was mostly desegregated or trying to be desegregated would have been Independence and the southwest part of the city. And I actually lived one block over. I lived on Michigan, which was one block east of Woodland, which was the dividing line. They made an arbitrary dividing line that everybody on the west side of Woodland and west of there would go to the desegregated southwest schools, and everybody east of there would remain in the segregated, which were mostly African American schools. Also during that period, I did a lot of substitute teaching over on the west side, and it wasn't desegregated at all. I mean, it was all Hispanic. I mean, except for a few people sprinkled in and out that lived there, but there were no efforts to desegregate there. And then when you really moved into this last desegregation, what we call the desegregation, the big desegregation act is what we called it. It just became kind of ludicrous in the sense that, and I didn't feel good about it at all. I went to all of the desegregation process, had what they called a monitoring committee then, and I went to nearly every meeting that I could go to. I didn't want to miss anything, and my sense is that initially when they wrote the desegregation plan, I don't know that they really expected it to pass, but it did. And it just became kind of ludicrous because you saw things like mothers who had families who had mixed race children. As you know, the mother can determine the race of the children. So you would have children that looked just like me that were listed as white. And people did this because the perception was that, you know, they had a lot of bells and whistles. There were lots of little gimmicks and a lot of what the kids call cool stuff. The kids could get better curricula and that kind of thing in the white areas. And I never had the sense that the whole desegregation process was, excuse me, to help all children. It was simply to attract white children, and somehow by osmosis, I guess, everybody was going to do better, and it never, ever happened. Sometimes I've actually gone to board meetings during this whole desegregation process. I saw a man from the Northeast area. I'll never forget it. He got so angry at one of those board meetings. Man had a heart attack and died right there in the meeting. They had to take him out of there, and it created that kind of passion because I don't feel that we benefited on the east side where I lived. I don't feel that we benefited from it at all. Some of the things that I saw being done is when teachers retired or left or whatever through attrition. For example, in the desegregated schools, if a science teacher left, then you replace that person with the science teacher. At the schools in my area, if a science teacher left, they might get replaced with the custodian. So they did more of a body count instead of trying to really make sure that the curricular everything was even. And for me personally, I think my biggest involvement was as a parent and a community activist. I didn't really care that much about what color the kids were that were going to school. My issue, I wanted to see equity for the children, and I never saw that with the desegregation process here. I can remember, I can remember working with another group of parents, and the children's books and supplies at my child's elementary school were shameful. They were shameful. They got none of the new shiny bells and whistles. And it was so bad until myself and a group of parents, we actually broke into the book depository and took books and made sure that our children had them. And the interesting thing is that the depository was full of brand new books that had not been distributed to our schools. And about the end, right after my daughter graduated, I'm getting old now, I can't remember, I think she graduated from high school in 1990. That to me almost seemed like the last year that we had any type of real integrity in some of the inner city schools, because the group of kids she graduated with, those kids went on to college, they had advanced degrees. So the caliber of education was still, I'd say, pretty good up through the 90s. Whether the schools were desegregated or not. And some of that comes from the actual segregation, I mean, if you look at some of the source documents and look at how well prepared the teachers of color were, they were much better educated. And as you know, all of us know, during segregation, you know, if you were an engineer, so what? You were going to teach math or something. You weren't going to be an engineer, not in this part of the country. So there were still a lot of those teachers left. And my daughter was one of the children, as well as my sister, who benefited from those teachers. And at the time when they were in high school, which became an all-black school, at the time, they were after the time when it had been white and turned black. Because Southeast, where they went to school, I believe it was back in the 60s when that whole process began to happen. And so, but you still had a lot of really good teachers, you had very good, strong principals, but it was just a battle all of the time. I don't think our children benefited from it at all. And I mean that from the bottom of my heart. There are probably some children who did. Not mine. I'm still bitter about it. So we can move on if you like.
Okay. What efforts were put into place in Kansas City to integrate schools?
I don't know. I guess it depends on how you look at it. I mean, the busing was one of the major things that they did, which a lot of us had issues with that, since a bus route is roughly equivalent to a teacher's salary. So I would have rather seen better teachers personally. But the first big effort was to bring in suburban districts. That failed. That never happened. It just never happened. So there were some select schools that this is just my perspective, but there were some select schools that were chosen to really participate in it. Some would be on the far east side, like the elementary schools would have been Melcher and those kind of things. So, but eventually what it looked like was that the way it was divided up, it was like first through third and then fifth through sixth, you know, and so you begin to see families really getting divided, whereas when my children and their peers, my daughter and their peers were growing up, they all went to the same school. But with these efforts to really move children around, it was not uncommon at all for families to have their children in multiple schools, which made it incredibly difficult for the parents to really participate. If you've been in Kansas City long enough, you understand that you have a very poor public transportation. And some of the parents didn't even know where the schools were. I mean, like I live very close to the university campus. You had children from my neighborhood going to school all the way over in Sugar Creek, which is far north from here. I mean, it's way over. And so you just moved black kids into white schools, and then you moved, you didn't move too many white kids in the black schools. So I think one experiment that might have actually worked was Van Horn High School. It was one of the most multicultural schools in the whole process. But a few years ago, Van Horn went back to independence, so it's no longer a part of Kansas City, Missouri. But most of the burden for desegregation, I'm not saying white families were not affected, because they were, but they were affected in a different way. Most of the burden fell on the children of color, being bused into areas where they were unfamiliar with, they weren't wanted, the parents didn't even know where they were. And I think that where some of the white families were really affected was that instead of them being able to go to, all their children in the family go to the same neighborhood school where they were being, they arbitrarily divided it, so you had like these primary centers, then you had the upper grades, and it was like you keep moving around the same kids. And so, and then in theory, you were supposed to have these magnet schools, which would be open to all children and based on interest. Well, I think Kansas City sort of failed miserably at that, because it sort of became a way, in my mind, of income. I mean, the schools were funded so poorly until with desegregation came quite a bit of money, and so the magnet schools was a way of getting money. So you made all the high schools magnet schools, all the middle schools magnet schools, and so that sort of defeated the purpose. I mean, if you had like a couple of magnet schools based on interest, about the only one that has actually really prevailed has been Lincoln College Prep. And I think Paseo probably has remained. It's largely black now, but I still think it remained partially integrated, because it really was based on the arts. The students had the audition, and a lot of great things have come out of both of those schools. So I don't think that is that it couldn't work. I think the way it was implemented, it didn't work, if that makes sense.
So how did the community respond to these efforts?
I don't know. I don't really know, how did the community respond to those efforts? That is a really huge question, and I don't really have a simple answer for it. Initially, you had like advisory committees, and people were sort of paid a stipend, and there were all kinds of ideas about what was going to go into this school or what was going to go into that school. So I think initially a lot of people in the community were really interested, and they participated fully. While that was going on, you also still had people advocating for strengthening their own schools. So there was not a lot of equity. For example, I can remember an example of one of the schools which was called the Greek Magnet, where you would have Latin and games, or whatever was based on what the Greek people do, but which was fine. I don't really object to that, but there was so much opposition when you wanted to have an African magnet, which was sort of interesting, because people read the proposed African magnet is trying to make all the kids black. But I mean, the African-centered schools were really based on principles much more than they were race, and so those were not accepted. So if it had a white theme, it was fine. If it had something that wasn't considered a white theme, it wasn't fine. And that was a huge bone of contention, and it still is. So it started out, people worked on it, they exercised due diligence, they were interested, they really wanted to see better education for their children. It didn't happen. And one of the things that did happen is once people left elementary schools, the more affluent whites and blacks moved away. And so the schools then really were scrambling for white children, because really white children were disappearing in the Kansas City, Missouri school district. I mean, if you think about it, if you go from a student population of almost 90,000 down to, I don't know if it's even 20,000 now, I'm not really quite sure anymore. Where did those people go? I've often asked myself, where do the white children go to school? I mean, where do they go? They must go to private or parochial schools. They did not leave Kansas City. But the same effort was not put into the curricula and the infrastructure of the middle and the high schools. And this is where you really saw people kind of siphon off once they got into middle and high school, they just left.
What were some of the attitudes of educators and school staff at that time regarding school integration?
It was really varied in the sense the attitude of the school staff and the administration. A lot of what you begin to see was an influx of white principals or white leadership. And the talk of the community is that the black people were the mules. That's what we used to say. So they keep the black people as the mules, because even though you'd move in and all of a sudden now you have a white principal, because they felt like fundamentally they just felt that white people would not come to a school where they had black leadership. So they kept the black people there to do the work and to kind of make the school run, but then they had and I don't want to make it sound like all the white leadership was incompetent. That's not really what I'm trying to say here. I'm saying that the purpose was to draw white kids with white leaders. It wasn't to get the best principal for the school. And so there were a lot of black people who became sort of disgruntled, not sort of, some became very disgruntled because they realized it felt like they were being used. There was a lot of disgruntled. Teachers felt displaced. They could see some of the inequities. And I don't know that it was always the intent. You know, sometimes you have policies and then there are procedures. You know, you have policies and then there's how people do things. If they had like giveaways and things for students, some schools went so far as to only give them to the white students. They would never give them to the black students. So these kinds of things caused a lot of discontent among teachers as well as administrators. So it was not a happy time. It was tumultuous. During the 90s, toward closer to from 90 to maybe 95, I worked as a department head for the Kansas City, Missouri School District, but I worked with parent and community involvement. I came and I did that work under Dr. George Garcia. And we had what you called school advisory committees, which we'd had already for a number of years, but they had been subcontracted out to another agency, which would have been the Learning Exchange. So it would have been late 80s, really early 90s, that then the school district itself took over the school advisory committees. And school advisory committees worked on legislative issues. They were very interested, first and foremost, in having more community input into the schools, not just around desegregation, but they needed all of these parent committees to sign off on some of the desegregation mandates. And so it was kind of a tug, because a lot of administrators just kind of wanted like a parent group to sign off on whatever it was they were doing. And these people had not been trained to do that. So it was quite a little bit of butting heads there. And so that was interesting. It just, it started off exciting and it ended up not so exciting. Some of the parents, a lot of the parents and community members were much more knowledgeable than some other people about what was going on with it, because we went to all the desegregation monitoring committee meetings. We participated. We went to almost all the board meetings. So it wasn't like, you created things in your mind. You were there when it happened. So it was a very tumultuous time. It wasn't pretty. And also during that time you had multiple superintendents. So you couldn't really hone in on, my goodness, I think when all this started, Wheeler was superintendent. I'd have to check the accuracy on that, but we've had so many until it's kind of, I think it's sort of inappropriate to say whether they did a good job or not. They weren't here long enough to really do a good job. You know, they were in and out, in and out, in and out, and so people came in on different ends of the plan. People gave lip service to making it happen, but it just, it's like wagging, you know, it's like a dog chasing its own tail. I remember once looking upward at Paseo High School. I was actually riding with the superintendent that day. And I said, boy, that is such a beautiful structure. What are the plans? So how are we going to maintain these new buildings? He said, well, we haven't really allocated money for that yet. And so it's kind of a thing. After a while, you begin to feel like the whole thing was a facade, and you begin to really realize that the things they looked at were not maybe the issues at all. I mean, tuck pointing a building is not going to bring people to the building. So it's just, I don't know. I don't really know how to answer that, but it was just, there was so much disappointment, so much anger. It was just, and you just felt like your own children had been completely abandoned, and it didn't work well for any of them. It didn't work well for the white students either, because it was more like chess pieces, like, you know, you're just maneuvering the same pieces going nowhere. You never actually reach, I mean, it was like it was checkmate from the beginning. And I don't know, I really, as I'm hearing myself speak, I actually wish I could sound a little bit more positive, but it just was just rather sad. Well, I mean, some students who, I don't know, it ran the spectrum. I don't know that there was one attitude. A lot of the black kids really resented having to be bused. I mean, when you consider getting kids off to school, when you live in the neighborhood, you can barely get them to school on time. And so you've got kids who are getting up at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. I mean, to go to school to an area that they don't even know. So you had all of these sort of problems that you didn't expect to have happen. For example, when in the non-integrated area where we lived, the principal at the middle school, for example, shopped at the same grocery store as we did. And so if she said to a student, I'm going to tell your mother what you did, well, the kid could pretty much count on the fact that she would do that, because she shopped at the same store. Chances are she either went to the same church or would feel free to come to your church and would make sure your parents knew. And we had a lot of children. So I can remember, I never forget this, the bus picked the kids up. My kids lived like 2 miles from school. So if you lived over 1.9 miles, you could ride the bus to school. And the principal was coming by my house to do, I don't know, I wanted me to sign something. And the kids saw the principal and they're like, oh my goodness, she knows you. You know, so they knew she would tell. And so when you move into these other areas and people ask questions like, why are these kids cutting? Because they can. Nobody knew them. They knew they were not going to see anybody in the community to know who they were. So, you know, you begin to develop some of those kinds of issues. It was quite a huge disconnection. Our area principal that was loved at the high school, William Herron, when he died during that period, and when he died, there were nearly 8,000 people that came to the wake at the school just to pay their respects. I mean, and people will still quote William Herron. He always said, we will have school today with or without you. He'd come for you. if he knew your family didn't have lights, he'd pay your light bill or send somebody to do it. I mean, it was just that kind of thing. And the school was at capacity, unlike today where it is a virtual tomb. It was full. I mean, they didn't even have classrooms for all the children. There's so many there. So that all went away. It completely went away. And I will never forget this when they began to do the whole, we call it the desegregation transition. The people coming in didn't know any of the traditions. And some of these schools like Lincoln, Southeast, Paseo, some of these schools were very, very rich in tradition. And I can remember when they came into Southeast and moved the knight, the lady, and the round table. Oh my goodness, you almost had pandemonium up there. The children were insulted because these were the administrators doing this, not the other kids. White kids never came there, but the administration changed, and they didn't care. When I say they didn't care, they didn't know the tradition and they didn't bother to learn the tradition. They just made changes, and it just created hostility. It was a very hostile kind of environment, and that said a lot to the students. And then when the next group, we come from a very large extended family, and so when the next group of kids graduated, you could really tell the difference in how things had deteriorated. When mine graduated in 1990, everything was, I mean, you know, all the faculty had on their regalia. I mean, it was gorgeous. It was beautiful. The next couple of years, faculty showed up. They didn't have on regalia. You know, it just was no longer special. And the students felt it. And when the pride left, the schools have been the anchors in these communities. People, very often when they look inside of a black community, they just automatically assume it's the churches that were the anchors. And in some instances, the churches were. I agree that religion was a very important part of our community, but the schools were the true anchors. Nearly everything we did was centered around the school. All of that went away. It all went away. And pretty soon, all they offered was sports. You know, so it was just very sad to watch it die. And with that dying, everything died. And those who could left. I mean, it's just a few of us behind who were somewhat affluent that stayed. You know, most people are gone. And it was a lot of money. And I do think that I think initially there were some lofty goals that, had it been managed and tempered, maybe some of it could have happened. But I think one of the things we don't talk about is the funding for our schools and how nearly all of the significant funding that we had was coming in from desegregation. And so it just became, I think, a way to get funds. It didn't, I won't say that no children were helped, but not that many. I mean, the only schools that were really integrated would have been Lincoln and Paseo and Van Horn. East High School as well as Westport at that time were active. They were already, you didn't have to do a lot of integration just because of where they sat. They sat in areas that were multicultural. And so sort of inadvertently, Westport became the immigrant school. The European immigrants were mostly at Westport. Northeast Northeast and East had most of the African immigrants. And that stayed that way until they closed. They never really made efforts to desegregate those schools. And if you have 8 high schools and you make all 8 high schools magnet, it's not going to happen. I mean, it's just not going to happen. And so, but it was the way that they could afford to keep the schools open, so that's what they did.
And in what ways do you feel that you contributed to school integration?
Well, I don't know that I really contributed to school. I had never really thought about how I contributed to school integration. I do think, I think I was very active in working with community and with parents. And probably for the first time, we had mixed groups of parents working together on either their schools or their community or legislative issues. So I think I contributed a lot from that perspective. As far as integrating children and all of that, I didn't have much contribution, but I did a lot with the parents. I also did quite a lot of training with teachers. I don't think we did nearly enough training with teachers because you've gone from, I mean, if you look at public schools today, we all know that over 90% of the instruction are white and female. And so that was a huge transition, and it's not been too much done since then to sort of do anything about that. I mean, I'm not saying they can't teach kids, but we really have to do some things differently because there's a huge culture clash. But my biggest input was with parents and community and working with multicultural groups, and I think we were effective with that.
And how did efforts to integrate schools affect your role in the district?
I think that in some instances where where schools, if you've had administration, for example, when I ran the Parent Community Action Center, I was the executive director. If we had schools that had never worked or had very little knowledge of working with multicultural groups, I mean, you got called a lot to come out and work with the parents. You know, in schools that were sailing right along, not too much, but we went where we were needed, and we had to really train parents on how to work in the schools, and it became sort of a catch-22. The parents began to work so well together until they actually inadvertently, on some levels, became threats to the administration, because in so much of the desegregation activities, you had to have parents sign off. And now we've trained all these parents to be active and vocal and knowledgeable, and these were not parents who were signing off. They wanted to know what was going on. They wanted to look at the underneath. And so it could sometimes be contentious.
And given your role in the district during 1971 to 1997, describe what you recall as academic outcomes for students.
Well, I think early on, as with all school districts, it goes through a lot of a transition, but I think our kids up through the 80s and the very early 90s got a pretty good education. I mean, when they were in elementary and middle school, they took the Iowa Test of Basic Skills, which was a very sophisticated test, and most of the kids were passing it. Most of the kids, over 70%, were passing it. You had pretty high attendance. But as it began to evolve, these kinds of things began to erode. And I saw, well, right alongside desegregation, as I said, my family was not in a desegregated school, so you had to really fight to have what you wanted in their schools. And I began to see that in the late 80s. I can remember when my daughter was going to middle school, and they did not offer algebra. Well, I was outraged. I couldn't understand. What do you mean you don't have algebra in 8th grade? How are they ever going to take advanced? You know, I believe math is algebra is a gatekeeping course. So if you don't pass algebra, you don't have any dreams of becoming a doctor, a lawyer, or whatever. So a group of us, we really fought to have it included in her school, and they put it in there, and she did very well and went into advanced algebra and trig when she got to high school, but it wasn't in all the schools. So if you didn't fight for it, you didn't get it. Whereas at that time, in the desegregated or in the predominantly white schools, they had it. So I began to see those kinds of discrepancies. And she got a good education, but we had to start really fighting in the 80s for it. You had to fight for everything. I told you we had to fight for books. The books went to the white children. And I mean, I say that sadly, but it was true. It makes you sound like you're anti the white children, but that's not. You want all the children to have it, and our children didn't. That's why we broke into the book depository and took them. And they were sitting there. They could have been distributed, but they weren't. So it was a constant fight, a constant battle. And my group of parents kind of faded on. I mean, we're getting older. And the next generation didn't really pick up the fight or were more affluent and moved. You know, so it began to go down. It really went down in the 90s. So much so that by the time my nieces and nephews, who were just under my daughter, they had 4 children, only 2 of them even went to public schools. And my brother and his wife, they did not have money. They found money to put 2 of their children in private schools because Kansas City schools were getting so, they were closing them and they just weren't up to snuff. And we saw it big toward the end, mid-90s on. It just got horrible.
What might have been some of the social outcomes for students of school desegregation?
Well, there could have been all types of positive outcomes if desegregation in and of itself, I mean, it's debatable whether that's a viable goal. I mean, I would prefer, rather than to focus on desegregation, I would prefer to focus on quality schools. I love the idea, for example, of true magnet schools where irrespective of children's color or their background or their culture, that they could actually go to a school, and if they were interested in film or acting or whatever, if they could have actually done that and brought that together, and I think that would have been a beautiful outcome. And I think on some levels, in the couple of schools that did it, those were some of the outcomes. But I think that when we call it desegregation, I'm not sure, to be perfectly frank, I'm not sure that that's what it was. I think it was a much more of an economic ploy to fund a flagging school district than to actually desegregate. Because I think when we look at desegregation, we tried to look at desegregation sort of in a vacuum. As you all know, Kansas City is one of the most hyper-segregated cities in the United States. So to look at school desegregation within the context of a highly segregated neighborhoods, it's a really challenging and difficult thing to do. And I feel that we could have been more creative. I don't know that having all the suburban districts in would have been beneficial to children. Personally, I don't see the benefit of having any child ride a bus an hour to go anywhere. I just, unless that's what you have to do to go to school. But if you're passing 18 schools to go to a school, for me, that's not viable. So I don't know that desegregation was ever a viable. I think, again, I'll just repeat, I think if we could have just focused on quality schools, maybe the magnet concept and some different things like that, I feel that we would have gotten a lot farther. But I think that the thing that we never talk about is the economic condition that the schools were in at the time, and that this was sort of a way to keep the schools going. And I don't know that the children were ever at the heart of this plan. And I'm not saying I'm right, but I truly believe that.
What changes do you think are needed to improve outcomes for students in today's urban public schools?
Oh gosh, that could have been one question for the whole interview. I think first of all, you have to have schools. You have to have schools that don't mimic prisons. In inner city schools, you don't have any inner city public schools besides charters. Now, the charters are not guilty of this, but the other schools, they still all have these metal detectors. They teach children like they go into prison. They've criminalized the behavior. I taught in schools. I've taught in the suburban districts. I taught elementary, middle, and high school, and it's very different in the city than it is in the suburban schools. And it's sort of interesting because the way we treat the children, it tells them that they're nothing. We don't treat them like they're something. School has become, it breaks my heart to walk into a school and see children who are so focused on getting their belt off in time so they can go through the metal detector instead of being concerned about what they're going to be learning in class. We're all educators. We all know that the one construct that is correlated most highly with children's academic success is teacher expectations. So I think that since we now have a predominantly white and female teacher force, I think we need to do a lot more work with white privilege and helping our faculty and teachers understand the children that they serve. I don't know that that's going to change. So I just think first we need to have schools instead of miniature prisons. And I could talk on that a long, long time, and we don't want to do that here. But my thinking is sort of jaded at this point, and I grew up a lot of my young life here in Kansas City. I've seen a lot of damage with segregation here. I don't know that the schools have improved that at all, except let one group of children know that they didn't feel worth much. So I think we could treat them like students, make a school instead of a prison camp. And it's kind of interesting because the way we actually manage the children doesn't match what goes on in the country. You're not having mass shootings in poor inner city schools. But in the schools that are having these mass shootings, they don't have any of these metal detectors and all this sort of thing, So when I taught middle school, I actually had parole officers sitting in my classroom watching to see how their children who'd been in the juvenile system, the juvenile system here in Kansas City, is supposed to be county-wide, which is 10% and under black. But over 95% of all the kids in the Juvenile Justice Center are black. So I think those things have to change. And I think we've abandoned these children. We don't have schools anymore. We're trying to build some, or we're talking about them, but we don't have them. And I know that's kind of a glass half empty thing. I mean, you've got a couple of schools And we seem to be satisfied with that. It's sort of interesting. My grandson goes to a Kansas City, Missouri public school. It's a well-integrated school. It was been integrated ever since the first desegregation lawsuit, which was 6C, which was the first way they carved these schools up. But it's remained integrated. It is fully accredited. Now, if you can do that in one school, why can't you do that in other schools? You know, so you can. It's just, do you want to? So, and I find it unacceptable. I mean, I'm just amazed when I see these signs that say, we are provisionally accredited. I would not put up a sign that said I was provisionally accredited. You can be fully accredited. The school he goes to, now you're looking at a whole mass school district and you find a couple that are fully accredited.
Is there anything else that you would like to share with us about school integration in Kansas City?
There is no school integration in Kansas City. I mean, it really isn't. You have a couple of schools that are based on themes that have some integration. And I don't think integration was ever an adequate construct to build a school around. And I just say we don't have it. And I'm not saying I'm right, but I don't see it. The schools in my neighborhood are still black. All of them. Well, I should say the few that are left. They're black and they're poor. And they've been that way. So it's different in the sense that from the original example I gave, Humboldt, where the way they integrated was to put white teachers with the white kids, black teachers with the black kids, put them on different floors. They don't have recess together. They don't have lunch together. They call that integrated. So it never was a goal, really, in my mind. It was talk. And it's sort of interesting. If you read all the things that go along with the desegregation lawsuit type thing, academic achievement was one of the lesser things that they talked about in the literature. And I think that it was some type of itinerant goal setting or something, in the sense that once you achieve integration, then all things will be wonderful. That didn't happen. And I don't think it ever will. You know, and this is on Kansas City, but if you go to St. Louis, for example, and you see some of the schools that are left in the city, why they are in such horrible shape until you don't even know if you can't look at the building and tell if they're open or closed. And the initial efforts to talk about desegregation there were horrible. I mean, they were ugly. I mean, I've seen board meetings that were publicized on TV that were just outrageous. It's the only thing I could use to describe it. But it's been volatile. It's just interesting, and the people who suffered have been the children.